thank you everyone for joining us. We're up to 64 attendees, which is amazing. So I'm going to give the shortest of introductions to our speakers and let them speak to their backgrounds and how they'd like to describe themselves. So far on the line, we have Lorena Ramírez-López, who will be speaking first, and Muira McCammon. I am so glad to have them bring their perspectives. And Michael Nelson, who is a professor at Old Dominion University, will be joining us very shortly. Lorena, if you wouldn't mind kicking this all off with your awesome information about translation and ethics and archiving the web.
Hello, thank you again, Anna, for inviting me. The question of how to ethically collect and use web archives is difficult, and seeing as many institutions are already collecting content from other countries and communities with good intentions, this generates other problems when these materials are only housed in the United States and not being described, accessed, and processed by those communities that are creating those online content. And even when offered the tools, there is a learning curve on how to use them. Imagine trying to not only translate technical to a non-technical level, but also needing to translate them from English as well. This is not the first time we talk about ethics and web archives. In 2018, there was Ethics and Archiving the Web forum hosted by New Museum and organized by Rhizome in the collaboration with the University of California at Riverside Library, the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, and the Documenting the Now project. One of the presentations that really stuck with me comes from artist Mohsin Alahari. The presentation on cultural heritage, digital colonialism, and web archiving involves her artwork series, Material Speculation ISIS 2015-2016, a project that centers around an effort to 3D print replicas of 12 artifacts destroyed by ISIS in 2015 and the issues of where and how to release this data. The dilemma she faced were the options: either host these artifacts on a Western-based platform or essentially figure out how to solve the digital gap and develop an infrastructure in these other countries because institutions don't have similar technologies, resources, and archivists to preserve digital files at best practice standards. There's a lack of access for those who actually own these cultures and histories. And when it comes to archiving this data on Western cloud-based platforms, Mohsin asked questions about agencies of these platforms, language barriers, technical difficulties such as censorship, slow internet, etc., and also the problem of white curation. So the conference considered how web archives can better serve their publics and historical record, and what I'm posing is how web archive tools give agency to better serve their publics to make their own historical records. Even though I will be talking about language, specifically the English and Spanish languages, I do want to stress that it's not just about language. Echoing the same concerns that Mohsin stated 3 years ago, we need to question the agency of our platforms. In terms of finances for using these platforms, the cost is always too high and in dollars and not doable even on a sliding scale. There's also that extra effort and work that others need to do in order to achieve these expected standards established by institutions that often don't even seem to follow their own examples. Now, in terms of language, the thing about tools shared in only English is the assumption that users have fluency in the English language. When even English users have difficulty on operating and understanding these tools and web archiving concepts, there needs to be more ways to lower these barriers of entry so others can use them. We can list out scenarios. How are these tools and instructions available? One barrier of entry is that some services and tools require paid accounts for one to use or even see examples. And even if a budget was acquired, you hit that language barrier where tools for capture are in English, the instructions are in English, and the support service is in English. And pushing forward, if content was captured, there's this question of, what do I do now? Which is a question we're all asking ourselves, but with platforms available, search and cataloging are in English. And it makes sense to see that the issue is language, so let's translate. And I'm sure we're all aware of the Google Translate extension that we can add to our websites. But even as advanced as the Google Translate app is getting, it's not going to translate the technical concepts and instructions that are required for these tools. And translation work, like any work, should be paid work. I think a couple of options to giving agency through these tools, besides just paying a specialist to translate, and yes, there are digital preservation specialists in South American countries, options that provide the space for collaboration and then the space for those users to have control over the content. Like if a user goes through all that effort in capturing, doing quality control and cataloging, they should be able to download and have access to their work files and content so they can share it more amply and comfortably to their users. Because our colleagues will know a better way to serve and assist their own publics and users than we would from the United States. And before I continue, I do want to preface that all code and digital tools have an inherent bias that favor a Western English Roman character user. This quote still stands even though it's been 6 years. Despite the democratizing promise of technology, the tools we build and provide are likely to reflect and perpetuate stereotypes, biases, and inequalities. All credit and power to Chris Borg. So what to do? Outreach, communication, meet that community. I know this is hard considering that even institutions barely talk to their own departments with overlapping work, but if our services or organizations are focused on international engagement and are working with communities, that outreach effort is a two-way street. There are a lot of communities already out there doing this work, making do with these English resources. A lot of resources we have access to. A lot of resources that we have circulated because either we wrote them or stumbled upon them and found it useful. There are more ways to give agency to users. These are just some recommendations one can do if we're writing content for how to archive the web. First, there are other ways to share information other than just text. And I'm not just thinking about videos, which also are helpful, but photos and screenshots are useful. Mentioning the environment you're working on is also helpful. If you have content or a blog post or instructions on web archiving and you're willing for it to be circulated and shared, putting licensing information so users can translate it is very needed. For example, if you use a Creative Commons license and put no derivatives, this also means no translations can be done. It's totally understandable to want to have control of your content, but if you're okay with translations, make sure that your content information is available so users can contact you and ask for permission. So a couple of projects that I'm a fan of is the International Digital Ephemeral Project by UCLA. It doesn't matter that this is focusing on digitizing. There are good steps and intentions that can be implemented into different situations. A lot of the success comes from UCLA's audiovisual specialists buying supplies and training other archivists and sharing that knowledge, giving the tools and building the skills so that the Instituto de Historia de Cuba can share for their own works and histories. And another example was a collaboration between Ana Perici herself, Archivistas in Spanglish, and Wet Labs. This happened when PASIG was hosted in Mexico back in 2019. Each party provided a piece for this workshop that none could have done on their own. The space aspect was also really important because instead of having that workshop where PASIG was being hosted and only limiting to PASIG attendees, which a lot were US users who already had access anyway, this opened the space and attendance to other interested parties. And disclosure, I am the community manager for a Web Recorder project now. I've been making an effort to not only outreach and engage with users, but also working with the team to break down our instructions for our tools. It's not enough to just have open source tools, which definitely lowers a lot of the barriers we mentioned, such as costs and agencies. But if we want to make web archiving for all actually a thing, we're figuring out what other obstacles are there that's holding back users. A lot of it was a learning curve. Open source tools, while free in cost, are very technical and a user has to put time and effort to learn how to use them. And we're grateful for the communities that are being established and already out there because a great colleague, Joanna Morfin, has been an advocate for this agency for communities in Mexico. It's through her that Web Recorder was able to talk with La Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. And so we established that these open source tools are hard. So we offered a time and space to communicate and discuss with UNAM and with little steps too. So they had Zoom and we had Zoom, so we'll use Zoom. We're not requiring any other party, either party to use a platform that requires another subscription or download. We discussed what would be the most accessible way to share documents and comments. Google Drive was an option, so Google Drive it was. And I'm not just doing the sole translation. Like I speak Spanish, but I also speak a different Spanish. So my role is gathering all the resources and examples and then going it over with them with UNAM so they can know what their options are and what workflows they can adapt. And I'm working with them to really develop a glossary in Spanish. So both parties are bringing skills for the main goal, which is to archive Mexico's websites dealing with COVID. And we're discussing on what to do with those works and data after they capture. So for example, Archive webpage is an extension that we have that you can install from Chrome like an app, which is nice and easy. And we went over the motions and instructions on how to use it. And now we're approaching that step in that workflow where it's now what? And I really wish that I can find and share with them some examples of workflows and infrastructures that are attainable. If you're listening and you're like, oh, I had a similar problem and I DIY'd it with my infrastructure and storage, please reach out. I would love to do what Joanna did for us and be that link and introduction so that the goal actually gets done. And this might be too altruistic, but that's how I feel collaboration should be. Knowing where you can help and having discussions and skill shares that empowers the user so that hopefully more collaboration and discussions can arise. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorena. So Muira, I am so grateful that you're able to join us today. It's been really nice working with you for the past few years around web archiving and ethics and your prior experience as a journalist, as well as your current experience as an academic at University of Pennsylvania. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And the presentation I'm giving here today to you all, After the State Tweets and Deletes, Ethical Approaches to Research and Scholarship Using Web Archives. I'm based and zooming in from Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm just really, really eager to hear your thoughts on this presentation, and please do connect with me. I'll share a bit more about that at the end. I'd love to chat more. So first, the roadmap. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I got to where I am today with regards to web archives, a little bit of a contextual background, insights into journalistic practices, and kind of a foray into what happens after deletion happens. I'm starting out with a screenshot of a Twitter account that I came across a few years ago. Anna mentioned that I was in journalism before I entered academia. And there was a time when I was trying to plan a trip, an investigative reporting trip to Guantanamo Bay. Guantanamo Bay, some of you may know about it. In the aftermath of 9/11, it became a holding site for what the U.S. national security state declared enemy combatants, and it remains today and has a rich history that predates 9/11 as well in terms of being a holding site for Haitian refugees as well in the 90s. I could say more on that, but I'm going to table it there. Anyhow, I was looking at the Joint Task Force Twitter feed, and the Joint Task Force of Guantanamo is the governing body that was responsible for maintaining the detention facilities. And I came across this Twitter account, and I started to retweet tweets from the account. And as I was digging through, the then hundreds of tweets that were there, actually thousands at the time, I noticed that the number of tweets in the Twitter feed started to go down. And at the time, I was bothered by this. I was perplexed. I was worried. I thought to myself, well, who's really keeping an archive of this Twitter account? But more importantly, what should I, as a US citizen, be thinking about when I'm looking at the thousands of Twitter accounts that the US government is experimenting with? So I sort of tried to think about what is it that I, as a web archivist and a emerging journalist and communication studies scholar, what are the questions that I have about these accounts? And one of the first questions that came to mind was, how does transparency sometimes serve agendas that are in fact far from transparent? I, at the time, was really, really worried about the impact of what it would mean that there were tweets from government accounts that were being deleted. But I also was trying to figure out, well, how do I decide whose Twitter accounts really matter and might matter to future generations? So these are some of the questions I was sitting with. So that sort of birthed an entire research agenda, which is focused on both what prompts deletion on Twitter accounts that the government agencies are running, what methods can journalists and researchers invoke to kind of keep track of these deletion practices, and also what records is the US government keeping on its own content creation and content removal practices. And I should just say on the right here are some of the tweets that came down from the Joint Task Force's Twitter account. So here we have one about the new internet that's being provided, and then an attempt to talk about military police training. You can understand why these might be somewhat controversial. And an important footnote to the history of this specific Twitter account is that it actually subsequently came down. The US Joint Task Force of Guantanamo Bay decided that it wasn't a good plan to run a Twitter account. But what's the bigger picture? This is just a kind of timeline of my own personal journey. I have been interested in deleted tweets by government actors for a while. And though I'm talking primarily today about the United States, I'd just like to say that these methods and practices have kind of a global applicability, and I'll speak more about that in a quick second. So these are some of the pieces that I've written along the way. I think a lot about George Orwell, probably way too much. And I'm not considering that you do the same, but one of the concepts that I want to bring to the fore is the idea of a memory hole. George Orwell was this famous writer, and he wrote this novel kind of imagining and discussing government information in a dystopian environment. And there was this concept of the memory hole, which is what happened to information that the government didn't want to be publicly available. And I think a lot about that, right? In today's democratic context, what is the information that governments are trying to put down their proverbial memory hole? And even to what extent is it helpful to think about specific US federal agencies maintaining their own memory holes? And there have been different efforts to kind of keep track of the government's memory holes. PolitWhoops is this really cool initiative that calls itself the only comprehensive collection of deleted tweets by US politicians. But the tricky thing there is that it's been really focused on politicians and not government institutions. And so what I'm interested in as a researcher and as an archivist is thinking more broadly about what about organizations and specifically government institutions is available and is being deleted, and how might we as a society think about these questions. So journalists have been on this for a bit. This week, you may have seen this deleted tweet. It made its way all around the internet. The U.S. Strategic Command, which is a military component, had this deleted tweet. And of course, journalists were like, what does it mean? And in this instance, there was a social media manager who, on behalf of the U.S. Strategic Command, had actually left their computer open, and a child had come and tweeted this out. Doesn't seem that significant in the grand scheme of things, right? But deletion can be a serious affair. It can be an instance where the government has misstepped, right? So sometimes tweets risk breaking the law. This was an example during Trump's tenure. The Treasury Department had retweeted a Trump tweet, and it got them in some hot water. As a researcher, I'm drawing on screenshots, semi-structured interviews with journalists, as well as Freedom of Information Act requests to try to understand kind of this ecosystem of deletion that's been happening, and I would add predated Trump, right? And I'm focusing on Twitter, but I should say that I'm broadly interested in all third-party social media platforms where government actors are trying to amplify and circulate their own speech. So David Agron is an interesting fellow. He is a freelancer based in Mexico. And I had an interesting interview with him where he had actually screenshot a tweet about COVID that the Mexican government had put forth, right? And so I'm fascinated by the fact that, he screenshots this tweet, he puts it on his Twitter feed, he's able to write about it. But he's also wondering, what are his other blind spots, right? What did he miss? What are the other deleted tweets that he wasn't able to grab? How do we think about these things more broadly? I have been interviewing journalists, primarily politics reporters in the US, but also scattered internationally, who are asking this question more broadly. What archival practices are feasible and possible within day-to-day reporting? People's perspectives and practices really do range. I was doing an interview with a journalist who told me that someday Twitter would be accessible and we would just be able to get the entire archive as a microchip that could be accessed. And, of course, that's not the case right now. And so the question that I've been asking myself and others is, where are you going for records of deletion? And whose deletions matter? And this is another reporter who I'd interviewed who was talking about, we're trying to cover the living historical record. And so part of the question is, to what extent are deleted tweets part of that living historical record? And, it's an interesting question, right? Because the government is using lots of different platforms to amplify, the government being the US government, but also other governments scattered globally are relying on these third-party social media platforms, but they're also creating records about the speech that they're putting on those platforms. So one of the things that I do, in addition to interviewing journalists and also creating some of my own high-fidelity web archives, I've experimented over the years with Web Recorder, and I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A, is that there's no full archive available. There's so many different Twitter accounts over the years that have been created and subsequently deactivated overnight. And it's absolutely impossible to keep track of everything. And so the question is, what is the potential of, say, Freedom of Information Act requests? This is one document that I had gotten access to because I went to the government and I said, hey, I'd like records of your deleted tweets. And so this is a type of exchange that I was able to get where government employees were actually emailing each other and saying, hey, we need to bring this tweet down. And so this was the US Pacific Command that had this type of exchange. I'm at time. This is my contact information. Really eager to connect with anyone who's interested in these themes more broadly. And I'm also happy to talk about kind of the process of public records requests if you're interested in giving that a go in your respective municipality.
Excellent. Thank you, Muira. That was awesome. So I think I'm going to bring this over to Michael, who I'm really glad could join us and again presented at Ethics in Archiving the Web in 2018. This is actually a great presentation to join the content that Muira just covered very well, because Michael, I think you have some really good insights on Twitter and authenticity and accountability around tweets and how things move forward. I would love it if you want to introduce yourself any further, because I've done the briefest of introductions to keep things moving. So handing it off to you.
Thank you so much. I'm a professor of computer science at Old Dominion University. It's in Norfolk, Virginia. And I'm going to be talking about what our research group has been doing in archiving the web, but specifically in archiving Twitter. And this is something that we've been examining for a while. And as Anna mentioned, going back to the Ethics in Archiving the Web workshop in 2018, it was one of the first times really started to focus our thoughts in this. So I'm going to give a survey of some of our work. Our collaborators are listed here, and there's going to be links throughout the presentation. But first, I'm going to start off in saying, don't do screenshots, okay? Screenshots are bad, okay? And if you do screenshots, then you're bad because screenshots are bad. Don't do screenshots. Now, why are screenshots bad? And what I'm going to say is screenshots are bad because we frequently see fake screenshots in social media. So I just pulled two recent ones from Twitter, and you look at this, and whenever you see these screenshots, you have to ask yourself, did they really tweet that? And oftentimes the answer is no. And it's either particular disinformation like we see on the left, or it's humor like we see on the right. But sometimes it's hard to tell, right? Because plausibility is sort of the essence of satire. So perhaps the Ted Cruz tweet was intended as humor, but it came across as real. And so there was a whole disinformation campaign about that. Now, full disclosure, I realize that screenshots serve a purpose and won't go away. Here are some legitimate reasons why we have screenshots. One, here we have an example where AOC is quote tweeting someone and making a commentary, but then the original quote tweet is gone. Either the tweet was deleted or the person closed their account. I don't know what happened. But AOC's commentary doesn't make any sense without the original tweet. And if she had used a screenshot, obviously we would not lose that context, even though the original tweet went away. The other aspect is it's a way to extend functionality of the platform. So here we have an example where Omar is effectively quote tweeting two different tweets and using screenshots to do it. And you can only quote tweet a single tweet, but she's got two in there, along with annotations, because the date's important in the context of these tweets. And she's effectively quote tweeting these without notification of the original accounts, right? So I mean, it's not a secret, everyone's checking her account, but they don't get a notification when they do this. So this is another reason why we have this. Another thing is screenshots provide platform interoperability. So here's a Facebook page that consists primarily, if not entirely, of screenshots from Twitter accounts. The social media platforms are not really incentivized to interoperate well, or certainly not as well as they could. And so one way users get around this is take a screenshot of one social media platform and then insert it in another social media platform. And then things like the likes and the shares and so forth that are a feature of a particular platform are then available within the host platform while maintaining the look and feel of the original platform. But this is where I'm going to say that it's anticlimactic. We've had 50 years of R&D and hypertext and text processing and networking, and somehow all we're doing is sharing screenshots of text with each other. The right way to do this, what I really want more people, journalists and historians and so forth, is to move away from just screenshots and actually archive the social media. When they see something that they want to comment on or preserve because they're afraid it's going to go away, like Muira was talking about, push it into the archive. Now, this is a functionality that's really only been available for the last 4 or 5 years, where prior to this, you had to wait for an archive to come and grab your content. But in the last 4 or 5 years, we've been able to submit a copy to the Internet Archive and also to other archives like Archive Today. And now we have tools like Web Recorder that allow you to record your own personal copy. But as far as public copies, if you see something and you think it's going to go away, make multiple copies. Don't just do a screenshot of it. And the reason here is the past is never dead. It's not even past. Now, as awesome as web archives are, there are a number of limitations that we have to consider. One is that the web archives aren't really the past. They are live web simulations of the past. And there is uncertainty and difficulty in the simulation when we replay the live web pages that are imitating the past. And some of the anomalies that arise in this replay allow opportunities for either misinformation or disinformation. And we'll take a look at a few examples. One is in archiving Twitter pages, you will sometimes get the template text, and that's the text saying how many followers, how many retweets, and so forth, in a different language than you expected. And here is Obama's page, and this was archived, 2017, and it's in a right to left language. It looks like Arabic, it's actually Urdu, but for the people who believe he's a secret Muslim, this is like a smoking gun evidence for him. Now, the text of the tweets, obviously they're going to stay in whatever language they were originally written in, but the template text is shifting. Now, this is not exactly a wrong result. It's an unexpected result. Some people on the web did see this content, and they did see it with this URL, right? But if you archived it and replayed it in a Western English language speaking environment, this is not the content that you expected to see. This is in contrast to this example, in which this page is in fact incorrect. And this comes from a post that Asood Alam did. And this is, I believe, an Indian journalist. And in this page, we see a combination of, in the blue, we have template text that's in Portuguese. And in the yellow, we have template text that's in English. And then after a minute, the load 20 more tweets or whatever pops up, and that's also in Urdu. Now, there was never a combination English, Portuguese, Urdu web page that was displayed on the web at this URL. This page never existed, yet this is what you get back when you replay it in the web. Now, this is, again, the text is unchanged, but this is potentially confusing for people who are going to consume this page. All right. Another thing that happened was in summer of 2020, Twitter completed the changeover from its old UI to its new UI. And the regular users no longer see the new UI on the live web. Now here I have a tweet from Anna advertising this workshop. This is what we saw on the live web, and this is what we see on the when we archive it. So if the old UI switched over in summer 2020, there's no reason why we would expect to see this old UI for something that was archived like 2 days ago. But it turns out the UI change was not just about the HTML, the entire structure underneath was changed. It actually, instead of getting a full HTML page, now you just get a skeleton HTML page with a bunch of API calls that load JSON and then populate the page. For a variety of reasons, that's difficult for general purpose web crawlers to archive. And so one workaround is the web archives, most of them now pretend like they're Googlebot, and Twitter still maintains the old UI, so Google can index the page. So the web archives pretend like they're Googlebot, and the result is you view a page on the live web, you archive it and replay it, and then it doesn't look exactly like you expected, right? You get the old user interface, even though you just archived it 10 seconds ago. This is potentially confusing. If the new UI is archived, it can actually inject some weird artifacts, right? So here we have a video, and this is not a secret message from Q or the deep state or something. This is what we have is competing JavaScript trying to fight for essentially the control and the presentation of the page. And they're each making assumptions. And basically the Twitter JavaScript is inserting this in here. And it's, again, doesn't necessarily change the meaning of the page, but it is potentially confusing. This is more of a problem. So Twitter recently introduced two kinds of labels. One is a fact check label, and the other one is a violated Twitter rules label. And Kritika Garg and Haimarsha Jayanetti worked on this and a couple of other projects. And there's more details about what's happening here. But basically what we have is the old UI now supports, for a while it didn't support either of the labels, it now supports one of the labels. And you can archive a labeled page. Remember, we archive in the old UI. That label that is not supported by the old UI will then disappear. So if you want to prove that Twitter did or did not label something, you can cherry pick the archived version that you want to present. This is a problem because it allows people to select the evidence that they want to present. The worst problem is if Twitter archives your page in the new UI, you get what we call temporal violations, or you'll most likely get temporal violations. Now, in some areas, it doesn't matter. So or probably doesn't matter. In the bio part, the fact that the JSON that populates the bio section is 29 hours old doesn't matter. Who changes their bio that often? Some of these that you might like, who knows? Maybe that doesn't matter. The what's happening, this is almost a month out of sync. That's kind of weird. And maybe if you're studying how Twitter arranged cultural information, maybe that's important. The more pressing thing is when you display this page and the JSON that populates the tweets is over a day old. And this is an account that tweeted a lot and is bursty, so maybe you're not always going to miss 71 tweets, but 29 hours of missing content means 71 missing tweets, and that's silent. So you don't see this show up as this is greatly out of sync with the host HTML page. Now, this is an account that's no longer on the live web. Now, there are independent third-party archives that we can check against, but for other suspended or deleted accounts, we don't have this gold standard data to figure out exactly what we're missing. And it's going to appear like this is the page as it was on August 18, 2020, and that's not the case. All right. Now, as far as accounts that are not on the live web, the embedded tweets don't disappear. That's a good thing. But the problem is the embedded tweets can now be faked. And I'm going to try this little short video. So this one of the things, please pause. All right, so one of the things we talk about in the lab is a pineapple on pizza. And here are two tweets, embedded tweets that I did. These are the edited versions. Now, this is still a live web tweet, and this one has been deleted. When this reloads and it contacts Twitter, you'll see that the fake text will be replaced by the correct text. But in this tweet that has also been faked, since that tweet is now deleted, there is no correct text to fix the uncorrected text. So when we do this, we see what the real text is. Twitter has fixed that, but since it's off, it's no longer on the live web, this quote tweet that remains, which is good, can be faked, and all these quote tweets that are embedded in pages can be made to say anything we want. So Sean Jones has worked on archive-aware embeddings so that you can reference the archive to figure out if the text said what the embed says it said. There's more detail there. But one of the problems is looking up tweets in the archive is difficult. It's possible to get false negatives. The archives actually have a lot more tweets or Twitter pages, not just tweets, but Twitter pages in general, but they have all kinds of crazy arguments. And in this one example, there are over 100 variations of the URL. Now, because it's a popular account, the main URL has been archived, but frequently, especially via embedded tweets, there are additional arguments that are almost impossible to predict in advance. And it might be archived under those arguments, but you won't be able to discover it, not easily. Regular users can. So in summary, screenshots are bad, web archives are good, but the uncertainty in replaying tweets from web archives allows for misinformation and disinformation. One, the replay doesn't always match our live web experience. Two, the old UI doesn't have the complete functionality of the new UI. And if we do archive the new UI, we can get the potential of significant temporal violations. Embedded tweets can be made to say anything that we want. And if you try to verify it in the archive, it's possible that you'll have false negatives and the archive actually has the content, but you just can't find it. And I think I'm a little over time, so I'm going to stop. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.